Yeah, we're really excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. So, we're coming to share with you a little bit today about the ways that we can integrate mobility into everyday life. And so, of course, my big push is through gardening, but Devin's going to also share some of his expertise.
All right.
Go ahead, Devin.
Okay. Let me see if I can click. So, as thank you for the nice introduction. So, my name's Devin Hedris. I'm an enrolled member of MHA Nation, which is in Western North Dakota, or otherwise known as the Three Affiliated Tribes. I was raised by my late grandmother, Juanita Helfrey, who was someone who was a strict Indigenous health advocate and stuff like that, all across North Dakota, even across the world. And she had a really big presence in my life in terms of learning kind of traditional life ways without really making them seem, traditional or special, just how the way she lived her life and just her wellness and just seeing how active she was, even in her kind of like final year of life. I would talk to Ruth about this a lot. In the last year of my grandmother's life, actually, I have a little funny story to mention that she was someone who was very strict about her routine. And so she would go and tend to her garden in the mornings and stuff like that. And so she really struggled with COPD. And so she couldn't breathe that well due to smoking. And here I come home from school one day, expecting to do the chores around the house and everything. And I go into the backyard and I see her holding her oxygen tank, tending to her garden on her hands and knees. Mind you, she couldn't walk 5 steps without losing her breath. So that just basically explains the kind of house I was raised in and the kind of woman she was. But my educational background, so as mentioned in my introduction, I got my bachelor's in biochemistry. I took the MCAT and was kind of like, all right, I need to take a break and step away. And so I was like, what's something else I'm very passionate about, which was Indigenous health. And UND's program really just aligned with what I wanted to do, and I'm finishing my final semester. And so hopefully this can all go well and have my MPH here in a couple months. But in between that time, I took a year off between my undergrad and my graduate experience, and I worked for ICWA in North Dakota for Grand Forks County. And so I got to experience child welfare, from a native perspective, and then kind of seeing where the state was coming from. And so that just really made me want to push into public health or even just like medical school to serve native communities because I see that giant need there. And then lastly, I like to run ultra marathons. I'm an endurance athlete. So my wife and I created this business, Brighthawk Fitness, and I'm the co-owner, kind of just overseeing things. Um, but recently, in this picture right here on the right, I just finished a 100K, which is 62 miles in Arizona. That was on Valentine's Day. And so my big motivation behind that was like, all right, I don't get to take my wife out for dinner. I better make this worth it. So yeah, I finished the 100K, and then this past weekend actually I ran a 50K with my father, which was his first time, and so got to pace him and really get to understand him as an individual and just really get to bond with him through that. But yeah, so we can hand it off to Ruth.
Yeah, so I'm also an enrolled tribal citizen of the three affiliated tribes, and then I'm also descended from the Fort Peck Sioux and Assiniboine. So among the Hiradza, I represent the Nagarawi, the Mahochari clan. So I'm part of our three clan, which is, and through that, I'm the Mahochari, and that translates to the Alkali Lodge, or Salted Lodge clan. And then at Fort Peck, I'm descended from the Assiniboine Red Bottom Band. So they're more concentrated in the Fraser area of northeastern Montana. And then I have a pretty diverse educational background in education, organismal biology and ecology, and forest and conservation sciences. Um, Currently, I'm working in the ag department of the Nueta Hiradza Sahnish College. So we do a lot of gardening, and we also work very much in our food system. So gardening, foraging, food preservation, cooking classes. We're also beginning to do some research into nutrition and wellness. And then similar to what Devin described, um, grew up in a multi-generational home and spent a lot of my childhood in the gardens with my grandmothers and my aunts. And in this picture, I was trying to, this is not the greatest picture. I mean, I'm not running a marathon or anything, but this was how I spent some of my time in October last year. I was fortunate to be able to go down to Hawaii and help one of the communities harvest guava, and then we cleaned it and processed it so that they had a local food that they were able to bring into the market. Okay, go ahead, Devin.
Yeah. So traditional lifeways have supported mobility throughout of lifetimes. So mobility as a way of life. And so this picture I have here on the right is actually one of the northeastern tribes from the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy. They're playing lacrosse. And so they were actually the people that founded lacrosse. And it is the sport it is today because of them. But traditionally, movement was woven into every part of life. And so a lot of plains tribes, just based on like history that I've read and stuff like that, for the men, our role was to, go out hunting, whether it was buffalo, elk, deer, and to really provide, protect and provide for the tribe. Whereas the women were more like tending to the lodges, tending to, the teepees, all of this stuff, as well as going out and getting firewood, which is, kind of crazy to think about today that those roles are reversed, where people believe it's common for the man to go chop down a tree and all of that stuff. But in our way, it was the women that were going out to do that. And the women were very active, and it's very frowned upon to be seen sitting around. That's still very common today. I'm like the only guy in an all women household, so not much sitting around going on. But cultural practices were holistic by design. And so if you see stuff like, so in the American Southwest, thinking Arizona, New Mexico, they actually have this really cool coming of age ceremony for young men where a young man, 12, 13 years old, would basically fill his mouth with water and he would run 80 to 90 miles to like a nearby tribe or wherever it may be, neighboring tribe. And that was his coming of age. And once he got there, they had to check his mouth to make sure he still had the water in there. And mind you, that's desert, all of these things, but it was seen as a coming of age ceremony. And so that's a direct example as to a cultural practice, but also seeing it as being woven into every day or every part of life. You look at stuff as like powwows, ceremony and community, going to powwows and stuff like that. You see the grass dancing, the different kinds of dancing. You really see like us get to really come together as one, even though we come from all these different tribes, all these different ways of life, all of this stuff, but we can really come together, enemies or not, historically speaking, that we can really come together and bond over something that is bigger than ourselves. That's very, spiritual to us. These weren't workout programs, so, I bet if we could go back a couple of centuries to talk to native and non-native ancestors and kind of tell them like, here's a workout program, they would kind of be like, what? Naturally they were very fit as people. It's just because it was the way life was back then. Traveling by horseback compared to car, traveling on foot if you didn't have a horse and stuff like that. These were all necessary things that we think are survival, but that was like just everyday life for our ancestors. And so I kind of wanted to talk about where we are now compared to where we were back then. So today, Native American communities face the nation's highest rates of chronic disease, and nearly 9 out of 10 elders live with one chronic condition. And so what that makes me think of is, during COVID in 2020, I believe that the highest rates of mortality were due to elders really suffering from chronic disease, and then that just made them twice as vulnerable or twice as susceptible to getting COVID pneumonia and ultimately passing on, right? And during COVID-19, our communities were hit the hardest just due to lack of resources, lack of medical care, all of these things, right? And we're very communal people, so we really still feel that today. historical trauma and systemic barriers disrupted centuries of active lifeways. And this is something that, you know, I'm not going to preach or talk too much on, but just like forced relocation, one of the direct examples would be maybe in the 1830s, like the Trail of Tears, such as those southeastern tribes being relocated to Oklahoma, loss of traditional lands. One big example that comes up, especially in this area, is the Black Hills, which is where my wife's Lakota. And so her people, and even historically, Ruthenized people, the Hidatsa and the Mandan were in the Black Hills at one point. And so when you just lose your way of life, when you look at natives and you look at traditional lands and all that stuff, you really, and then persistent poverty on the reservation. Reservations, there's just, it's better now, but historically speaking, there's just like a lack of economy, lack of jobs and stuff like that. It's more just like a lack of opportunity and a lack of resources and just maybe just exposure, and a lot of people bring up, well, why don't you just leave the reservation and go seek out better opportunity elsewhere? But then it's like when you leave the reservation, there's that big culture shock, right? You're around people who don't understand your sense of humor, your way of life, and all that stuff. And so then, say you're like Ruth and I, and we go and get our education and try to come back. That's still very common today for someone to, for us to be looked down upon because we get, and this is what people usually say, the white man's education, right? And so it's that culture shock and that duality of us trying to go out and get educated, but also come home and bring back those resources, or being able to utilize grant funding and stuff like that to bring it back home, and then being looked down upon for that. And so that's just kind of that duality that we face today. But returning to traditional practices offers a real path forward. And so, like the work that Ruth's doing and like all the food sovereignty and everything back at MHA, this is all stuff that's really reconnecting a lot of people to their roots, or just opening up the door and the opportunity for people to reconnect to those things and to be out on the land and to kind of experience what our ancestors experienced since time immemorial. We were a semi-nomadic, the Mandan and the Hidatsa, semi-nomadic, but we were also Earth Lodge tribes. And so we're very big into agriculture, such as the Three Sisters and all those things. And I'm sure Ruth will dive in more into that. But we're really seeing, especially from a youth perspective, of just seeing them being pointed in the positive direction when they do have the opportunity to practice traditional practices. And then, yeah, you can talk about this part.
Okay. So one of the books that I've been reading lately is the Blue Zones. And if you're familiar with the Blue Zones, there was a Netflix show about the Blue Zones. And one of the things that is they talk about are the Power Nine. And the very first thing they say is to move naturally. So one of the common, I should back up a little bit. If you're not familiar with a blue zone is an area across the globe where there's a concentration of people who live to be at least 100 years old. And so they were interested in why are there these concentrations? And so that they visited each of these different communities and were able to come up with some of the common things that they believe contributed to this long life. So the very first one they mention is to move naturally. So live in environments that constantly nudge them into moving, and they grow gardens. So if you're interested in that book, it's by Dan Buettner. Go ahead, Devin.
Yeah. And so I can kind of like click here and gives, I don't know, do you want to do this slide? I can do this slide too.
Go
But
ahead. You can.
yeah. So blue zones where people live the longest. And speaking on Dan Buettner as well, there's Dr. Mark Hyman. He's a functional medicine doctor actually out at Cleveland Clinic, and he does a lot of great work or did some research studying the blue zones. But blue zones residents don't exercise. So if we look at Sardinia, Icaria in Greece, Costa Rica, and even something in California, they move naturally every 10 to 20 minutes through gardening, walking, manual labor, and daily chores. And so, one of those examples that I was mentioning by Dr. Mark Hyman, he was speaking about how he visited this community in Sardinia. And he really noticed that these people were very interconnected and very detached from, today's world where it's computers, laptops, just constantly having things to do, right? Whereas these people looked at that as like a way of life. They detached from the electronics and everything like that, and they were more focused on community. But there were very small communities that they were noticing these blue zones, where it's maybe 10, 20, kind of just a smaller village of people. Everybody played their role, everybody kind of followed what they had to do. And so the examples of movement woven into daily life were such as walking to their neighbors. So, like I had mentioned with Dr. Mark Hyman, he was kind of just following the people in Sardinia around, and they were just hiking these mountains. They had right above this mountain, they were basically like tending to, you know, making bread, tending to the animals and stuff like that. And they're like, okay, let's go visit my sister up here. And what he noticed was they were hiking a mile like it was nothing up a steep mountain that was going up to 8, 9,000 feet. And so what they looked at, they didn't look at it as like, okay, I need to walk these stairs to get in shape. They're just like, oh, I'm going to see my sister, or I'm going to see my family. Um, and what they also noticed was, like I said, tending to gardens, like I just mentioned, but preparing food by hand. So whether it was churning to make bread and stuff like that, um, utilizing food from the garden, or they had livestock, whether it was sheep, cattle, and just kind of being able to ultimately respect the animal and being able to harvest the animal, and then being able to use every part of the animal, you know, to nourish their bodies, but also to utilize it as a chance to educate the kids on where their food comes from, and just kind of teaching them respect for life in general. And so I like to make the example that they mirror our traditional ways, such as, Native Americans being like Ruth and I, especially us in the plains, in the Great Plains area of America. Um, Blue Zones people stay mobile without gyms or structured workouts. And so our people were very much like that. And I explained that in previous slides, or in a previous slide. But we are very active people. We were always moving. And we believed in working very early in the day before the sun comes out, and then kind of spending the rest of the day tending to whatever, there was a need in our community, whether it was someone was going through something emotionally, someone was going through, they were grieving. And the point I'm trying to make here is that you didn't go through anything alone, just as they're seeing it here in these blue zones. Mentally, emotionally, spiritually, you guys were all interconnected, and it wasn't seen as this hierarchy. It was seen as, okay, if one thing's out of balance, how can we help bring this person back to baseline so we can all thrive? And they looked at it as something as, instead of, if someone got sick, they would look at it as a solution that needed to be solved, compared to, okay, this person's a problem and all of this stuff, and pushing them away. They knew that isolation wasn't the answer, and that reflected upon every facet of their way of life that they're seeing in these blue zones.
So, as we mentioned, one of the key things they identified was gardening. And so, the gardening plus traditional foods, we can grow our traditional foods, but then, too, we can also forage traditional foods. Next slide. So, for those of you who have gardened, um, you're definitely down on your knees a lot. You're right there in the soil. Go ahead, next slide. And so, another thing, you're either kneeling or sometimes when you're tending them when they're small, the plants, you're doing a lot of bending. So those are a couple of the contemporary pictures. And then to the right hand side, you see uh, And as Devin mentioned, this is a communal activity, traditionally a communal activity, something that families and communities did together. And that is a lot of corn. I've done braids of corn, and it can be your hands definitely feel it. And so if you imagine the amount of energy that took into growing all of that corn, and then my braid of corn is probably maybe a third of the size of the braid that they have there, but even that is relatively heavy amount of corn. And then the way we would garden would be it was primarily the women who were doing the gardening, and there was roles in there for the different generations of females, of women, so young girls and mothers and grandmothers working in that garden, so you had that multi-generational um, activity. Next slide. And then I mentioned kneeling or squatting. So also that was something that was recognized in the blue zones, was being able to be sitting on the ground or sitting on the floor and being able to move from those different positions very easily as an elder because of having the either gardening or being in that position being something that we're accustomed to. So um, having being going from a squatting or a kneeling position to a standing position as something you're normally doing is something to help with future mobility as an elder, as an older person. Go ahead, next slide. And then in this image, you we have a couple things. So she's bending again and tending her garden, and now the plants are getting taller. In the image on the right hand side, she's got a bundle on carrying on her back. So, maybe that was wood. Maybe it was probably not corn. Corn would have been carried in a basket, but it's also highly likely she was carrying a lot of berries that were foraged. And so having those weight bearing exercises as part of our traditional lifeways, like Devin said, it's not an exercise, you're not intentionally exercising. It's not a routine, but it's something that's part of our traditional lifeways. Next slide. And here you see these are a couple of historic pictures of processing squash. So again, she's sitting on the ground and she's slicing through all the squash, and she's got those rows and rows of squash. So she's sitting down now, but once she slices all those squash, then she's going to be hanging them on a drying rack. So she's has, these different motions where she's going to be reaching up, she's sitting, she'll be standing, and then the weight of all of those squash. Go ahead, next slide. And here's a image where processing some of our traditional squash. And this is my older clan sister, Bernadine Youngbird. So she does a lot of work with our traditional foods and is one of the women who still does our traditional gardening. And she's working with some of to her right, so which would be our left in the image, is her granddaughter. But this is at a youth camp, and so she was teaching about how to process squash and talking about seed saving. So again, the importance of all the activity that has gone into growing the squash, but that connect connection between the generations. So having that sense of community and sharing and learning is also an important part of our gardening. Next slide. And again, just all those different motions that we make when we're working in our gardens. So on the left hand side is, I saw Polly's on. So this is Polly's granddaughter working in one of the flower beds down at our garden, our college garden. And then on the right hand side, you see a woman in the garden with her rake. And so all of these, they're not, high energy, high impact motions or activities, but you definitely can feel it in your body when you've had a good day in the garden. Next slide. And then, like I mentioned, stretching. So reaching into those garden beds or reaching up and hanging up the squash or hanging up your corn braids to dry. So a lot of large motions that you're making. Next slide. And then I'll turn this over to you. I've talked a lot about gardening, but also just thinking about some of those foraged foods. Go ahead, Devin.
Yeah. And so some of like the traditional MHA foods and just kind of being able to really utilize my biochemistry side of the brain and kind of speak to what advantages it helps with you, you know, biochemically or just your body in general. So if we look at prairie turnips, squash, beans, these are all like nutrient dense powerhouses. So if you look at stuff that they're high in fiber, and so fiber is kind of just something that people don't get a lot of nowadays. That's why you kind of see a lot of digestive issues and stuff like that. Antioxidants, being able to keep your cells in your body healthy to help you with inflammation, help you with, to resist getting sick, stuff like that. Anti-inflammatory compounds that reduce joint pain and protect cartilage. And so I played college basketball, and I'm 26 years old, but I already have bad knees. So these are definitely like stuff that like I want to incorporate in my diet, but kind of just looking at things and doing the research behind, what Ruth and everybody else is doing back home, and just seeing the impact that it's having, not only, like I said, like mentally and emotionally, but physically too, of being able to reduce joint pain, because we know nowadays that sugar, especially native people being as lean as we were and being exposed to sugar, that's why we see so many problems with chronic disease. We see so many problems with joints and all this stuff. And so these are just a few examples of traditional plants to our tribe that have helped us, physically. Um, these foods sustained our ancestors' mobility for generations. So these same vegetables kept our people strong and active. And they knew these things, right? Like that they were good for you, that they would feel better and all these things. But they didn't think of it as something that, I have to get my macros in, like stuff we think of today, getting our protein, carbs, fat, and all of that stuff. They just saw it as like, okay, this makes us feel great as people. We're going to continue to consume these things. And now we look in a current and modern aspect, these things contain vitamin C, which is great for your immune system, vitamin K, calcium, which is obviously great for your bones, magnesium, which is essential for healthy joints and bones. And these are all stuff that I try to either incorporate into my everyday life, especially as like an ultra runner. Magnesium is extremely important, calcium, keeping my bones strong and all that stuff. And I noticed the difference when it comes race time because, such a small chance or small risk of injury. Um, I've been injured once, but that was due to underfueling and not utilizing this stuff enough and, really paying attention. Traditional foods is natural medicine. So squash and beans contain uh, sulforaphane and omega 3s that block inflammatory enzymes. And so omega 3s is something that was seen in like these traditional foods, but it's something that you see in a high abundance, especially for a Western tribe, on the coast or people along the Columbia River or on the East Coast, stuff such as like salmon. They're big time salmon, and we know that omega 3s are plentiful in these. And they really make a difference for, like I said, not only inflammation in your body, but inflammation in your brain and stuff like that. And so omega 3s was something that we didn't really, obviously, like I said, we didn't know how good this stuff was for us back then, but we just knew that it was leading to a long, healthy life. And so while turnips provide fiber that supports gut health and reduces inflammation throughout the body, like I said, as a whole, we've seen these traditional foods, or what's called traditional foods, but we considered our lifestyle as natural medicine.
And then just to follow up on that, can you please go back to that
Yeah.
slide? So those of you who aren't familiar with wild turnips, the image on the right-hand side shows holding a long braid of wild turnips, and I'm guessing there's probably close to 100 turnips on that braid. And so to dig wild turnips, again, that's just a very low impact um, activity, but you're doing a lot of walking and you're doing bending, and you're then to even get them to this point, once you dig them out of the ground, you're having to peel them and then braid them. So it is a lot of motion and activity that you're doing just to harvest the wild turnips. And then, as Devin shared, all of the nutritional benefits that our foods and turnips provide. Okay, go ahead, Devin.
Yeah.
Oh, this
Okay.
is me
Oh,
recognizing.
yeah,
I'll
yeah.
go
Go
ahead.
back. Go
Okay,
back.
no, that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So strength and mobility in your 20s and 30s is like really building your foundation. So This is for, if you look here on the right, it's young men hunting a buffalo, right? And this buffalo is running at them. They got the bow and arrow, all of this stuff, right? This is stuff that was seen in daily life, where we didn't have saddles for our horses, and so can you imagine the leg strength that they probably had, being able to hold on, their core strength to hold themselves upright, and I'm sure those bows, anybody that's a hunter here, if you don't know, compound bow, the lowest thing, to hurt an animal is 60 pounds. And the first time I tried pulling that back, I was like, wow, like it literally took all the might in my body. And so, considering probably how heavy those bows were, they were extremely strong. And so, if we look at strength and mobility in our 20s and 30s, strength training should start now, right? 2 to 3 times per week prevents future injury, builds lifelong habits. And so, growing up, like I said, I was an athlete. And so, this is something that, was just something that was incorporated in my daily life so that way I could be faster, stronger, or just kind of just maintain my frame to keep me healthy. And this is something that I've prioritized throughout my whole life, right? But I have a lot of friends who may not have had that exposure or had the opportunity to play sports in high school or college that don't really know these things. And, they're wondering why it's so easy for them to roll their ankle or so easy for them to experience a knee injury just doing things such as running or playing with their kids or whatever it is, right? And so strength training is very pivotal, and being able to either work with a strength trainer or being able to go on YouTube and just look up these things. There's an abundance amount of resources and content out there to really completely understand how to strength train. And mobility as longevity. And so full range of motion keeps your joints healthy and your body adaptable. And so there's this, everybody knows this thing, especially like kids or people my age, not kids, but people my age where they're addicted to this thing of longevity, right? Whether it's cold plunges, saunas, which is something I can always dive into. You look at us in the plains where we were, going into creeks to wash our bodies, which was extremely cold in the morning. And then you see we'd have sweat lodge ceremonies, which is, our way of praying, but like nowadays it's like a sauna. And Finland actually is big for that as well. But when we look at mobility as longevity, strength training really goes into that. It's strengthening these tendons, it's strengthening your joints, and then keeping your body adaptable if you want to go, like I said, chase your kids around and not worrying about rolling an ankle or hurting a knee or falling, whatever. And so what you do now, especially at this age in this area of life, it matters for decades and it carries on to the rest of your life. Not only in your body, but I feel it's like your habits as well. And so your body loses 3 to 5% of muscle mass per decade after age 30. And so for us men, right, they always say you hit your physical prime when you're 28 years old. And anytime I remember working out in the gym and I was trying to like load up the weight on the bench press, and one of the older guys in the gym was like, if you can't push that, don't try and do that after your age 30 because you're more susceptible to hurt your shoulders, and that'll be long term. And he was telling me this story of how he bench pressed and hurt his shoulder, and it still hurt to that day, and it's been 30 years. And so your 20s and 30s really needs to be your foundation, and this just builds off of historically our people were always really active, but nowadays we need to be really intentional about what we do. And so now it moves on to your 40s and 50s. So strength and mobility, protecting your joints and your independence. So strength training protects your joints. So I'd mentioned that in like in the previous slide of kind of just the effectiveness of being able to safely work out and safely strength train and to utilize proper form. And for a lot of people that I've seen who really actually started strength training in their 40s and 50s are the older men that come in there with the ego, and they're just loading up the weight and just increasing their risk of getting hurt. But if you look at strength training to protect your joints and you look at it as sort of like, as medicine, movement is medicine, you're reducing stress on your knees, your hips, and your back. And so I'm not a person that really stretches that much, and something I need to incorporate more into my own daily life. But it's something that hopefully I have as a daily habit in my 40s and 50s. So, my knees aren't giving out on me and I'm like limping around the house after just going to pick up something off the floor, whatever it may be. And the thing is like, I want to make a point is it's not too late to start. So strength training said improves flexibility, balance, and bone density at any age. And I'd reference in the Blue Zones slide when I was talking about Dr. Mark Hyman, and he's, I believe, in his 60s or early 70s, and he mentioned how he just started strength training and how he's noticing a benefit, by going and experimenting on himself and getting his labs checked, getting his hormones checked, and noticing that there's a big difference when he started strength training compared to when he didn't. And so consistency beats intensity. You want to find something that you can do 2 to 3 times minimum per week, that you can have proper form that prevents pain and builds resilience. And so something that's really, exercise is really big in my life. So it's, my wife and I have a 7-month-old son, right? And so as you can imagine, sleep is, not very plentiful right now. And so being able to do school full time and to support my wife and be the best husband that I can be and do all these things, I have to find a time where I can exercise during the day, right? And that's a habit that I'm establishing now, when it's stressful and everything, so that way in the future it's literally just building on this habit and being an example to my son and whatever future kids that we have, that you can start at any age, or that you can continue these habits on for as long as possible, and that there's benefits for your mind, your body, and your spirit. And so that's something I want to emphasize is consistency beats intensity. And so strength and mobility for elders, fall prevention, and independence. So when I was in Grand Forks, I'm in Billings, Montana now, and I was pre-med in my undergrad, I worked at the emergency department at All True Hospital in Grand Forks. And so I was a medical scribe, and so basically I was the person following the doctor around, helping with their charts and everything, but I was still side by side while they were, caring for these patients and stuff like that. And one of the things we really saw that was like really common was the inability for, elders to maintain their independence but want it so bad. And you can't really prescribe exercise to elders and stuff like that in a clinical setting, but just by laying the foundation, like I said in the previous one, you're just increasing that chance to be as independent for as long as possible. And so, yeah, and falls were a big thing. And, as you get older and stuff like that, I noticed a lot of these elders that were coming into the ER were on blood thinners. They had like cholesterol problems, all that stuff. And if you're on blood thinners and you fall, that there's an increased chance for, increased risk for strokes and stuff like that. And so, like I said, strength and mobility literally plays into every facet of your life. And so strength training reduces fall risk by 33%, 1/3. Lower body and balance exercises keep you safe and mobile. And so my wife and I, like I said, we live right outside of Billings. We got Laurel, Montana and all this stuff there. And a little funny story here. There's this elderly lady that we always see walking every morning or every afternoon and in Laurel, Montana. And so we just see her being like, walking around with this stick. She's a very fit lady, older lady and all that stuff. And it just kind of, my wife and I were like, we want to be like that when we get to that age, right? And so that all starts by really just putting an emphasis on maintaining what we do now, and then us just getting the message out there to hopefully inspire and empower others to want to strength train and do these things. And so, like I said previously, she was getting her steps in. We see her walk around town every single time we go into town. She's walking around in the summer, in the winter, whatever it may be. And so the benefits of doing and getting your steps in maintains your circulation in your body, your bone health. So like I said, if elders are usually susceptible to falling, and they have very, weak bones and stuff like that, you'll see broken hips, all of these things. But what people don't realize is when you're able to get 10,000 plus steps in a day, which is usually the required minimum, you see this boost in your mental clarity, this ability to think clearly. And so, like I said, physical, mental, emotional, all of these things play into, just how you live your daily life. And so put a big emphasis on this again. It's never too late. Even simple exercises such as, body weight squats, push-ups if you're able, or even just like lunges, whatever you can do to get your body moving, getting your steps in, everything will improve your strength, balance, and your quality of life. And excuse me, your quality of life is just based on habits that you establish now and not looking back at what you could have done in the past and regret, but starting now to give yourself an opportunity to enhance your quality of life and to be able to move and be able to be active as an elder. And so, returning to our roots, path forward. So, traditional activities equal modern fitness. And so, like the work that Ruth and everybody back home are doing, such as the gardening, or I know that our tribe incentivizes and has walking challenges. They have the Diabetes Golf League, where they don't allow people who are golfing to utilize golf carts and they have to walk the course, which is, I think, is great. You're incentivizing people to get out there and everything, and there's prizes at the end of the year, which I think they're mostly interested in. But they're still, exercising on a daily basis, and they're incentivized for it, which is pretty modern today. To get people started, they feel like they need to be incentivized. And culture practices build strength naturally, and so really reconnecting people to, like I said, the gardening, and then reconnecting people to their culture, no matter if they're native or non-native, and just really reconnecting physically, that you see the benefits in all facets of your life. And so start where you are. Any movement is better than none. Consistency beats perfection. And so that might seem very simple and like easier said than done, but it's just like, what do you do on, are you able to exercise on the day that you feel good? And are you able to exercise on a day that you feel bad, right? And just being able to really stack these habits to really help yourselves long term. Community based support works. And so I read this paper and it showed that returning to traditional land based activities reduces chronic disease and improves mental health. And so, like I mentioned, indigenous communities, American Indian communities, Native American communities, all across the United States really struggle with chronic disease. That's diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. Like we lead in all of these metrics, right? And we can you can look at it one way and blame history and just like forced relocation, all of these things. But when you can get past that and heal from those things, which a lot of our people are starting to nowadays, and be able to recreate that in a modern sense, being able to reconnect culturally through gardening, through hand games, and through, like in the East where they're doing lacrosse, being able to connect to what your ancestors did not only helps you from a chronic disease standpoint, but helps you, like I said, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And that's something I really harp on, is because our communities really struggle with physical health, mental health. And so it's just not necessarily coming in, having someone come in and fix us, but for someone to come in and help us recognize the power that we already have and the power that we do have and we do carry, and being able to get back to where we were together, right? I'm big on coexistence, so click on the next slide.
Yeah, and so we're coming in on the end of our time with you and just wanted to recognize some of the people who've been able to carry and then pass this knowledge on. So among the Mandan Hidatsa and Arikara people, we have a number of individuals who have carried on the tradition of gardening and carried our seeds forward. So acknowledging them, and then go ahead to the next slide. And then our own families too. So one thing that wasn't mentioned is that Devin is my nephew, and so you see on the bottom left hand, you see my mother, and then um, on the bottom right hand, so the two ladies that are seated on the ground on the bottom right hand is Devin's grandmother, and then on the right hand side of the images on the horseback are Devin's grandfather and his companion.
Yep. Very, very influential ladies, that's for sure. And yeah, I wanted to mention that Ruth Ann is my auntie towards the end, so that way you guys weren't like, oh, this is just connecting because they're related.
And so we thank you for the time and the opportunity to share a little bit about the work that we do and our experiences around mobility. And there's our contact information. And then I know too, there's some comments in the chat.